Imagine this. A quiet southern town where the police rule with unchecked power. One night, a routine traffic stop goes too far. An officer strikes a woman in front of a crowd. But what he doesn't realize, she's the new police commissioner. And she's about to turn the system against him. Before we dive into this gripping story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subs. Your support keeps us bringing you more powerful content. The streets of Ashton lay quiet under the amber glow of old streetlights. It was the kind of town where silence held weight, where people knew better than to ask too many questions. The courthouse, the diner, the gas station, nothing had changed much in decades. But inside the police department, things were shifting in a way that made certain men uncomfortable. Erica Monroe had spent months trying to make sense of the mess she inherited. As the first black commissioner of Ashton, she walked into an office thick with resistance. Officers who wouldn't meet her gaze. Paperwork that mysteriously went missing. Old alliances she hadn't yet mapped out. It was a slow war. The kind fought with quiet defiance rather than open rebellion. And then there was Craig Holt. Holt had been in the Ashton Police Department for 22 years. Long enough to believe that his word meant more than the law itself. He had survived mayors coming and going, commissioners trying to clean things up. Every time, he remained. He knew which judges owed him favors, which prosecutors would let things slide. As far as he was concerned, Monroe was just another outsider who thought she could change things. She'd learn soon enough. It was just past midnight when Monroe took the long way home. Her sleek black car cutting through the empty streets. The day had been exhausting, filled with back-to-back meetings and another round of pushback from the old guard at the department. She turned onto Willow Avenue, the road wide and empty, when red and blue lights suddenly flared in her mirror. She exhaled sharply, pulling over to the curb. The crunch of boots against pavement was slow, deliberate. Holt's face appeared in her side mirror before she even had a chance to process why she had been stopped. "License and registration," he said flatly, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over her dashboard. She didn't move immediately. "Is there a reason I was pulled over, Officer Holt?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "I said, license and registration." She kept her hands in sight as she reached for her documents, moving with the kind of careful precision that came from experience. She had lived this moment before, just like countless others in her community. He snatched the papers from her hand, glancing at them without much interest. "You know, nice car like this, late at night, might make a guy wonder what you're doing out here," he said, tapping the edge of her ID against his palm. Monroe's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "I didn't realize it was a crime to drive home after work." Holt chuckled, tucking her papers into his pocket instead of handing them back. "Some folks know their place around here. Others need a reminder." The words sat between them, heavy and deliberate. She met his gaze in the mirror, her face unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. "No," she replied calmly. His smile faded. "What did you say?" "I said no." The air seemed to shift. A car slowed in the distance, the driver pausing at the sight of flashing lights. Across the street, the old convenience store had a few late-night customers lingering outside. One of them pulled out a phone. Holt's jaw flexed. He had done this routine 100 times before. A little show of force, a little intimidation, and people fell in line. But Monroe wasn't flinching. "You resisting?" he asked, stepping closer. She looked up at him, her voice level. "I'm asking you for a reason. If you don't have one, then return my license and let me be on my way." A muscle in his temple twitched. And then, with no warning, his hand lashed out, striking her across the face with a sharp crack. A gasp rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. The silence that followed was deafening. Monroe didn't move, even as the sting spread across her cheek. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Around them, phones were raised, red dots blinking as they recorded. Holt barely looked at them. He had been here before. But then, from the crowd, someone murmured her name. "That's Commissioner Monroe," a voice said. The words landed like a thunderclap. Holt's smirk flickered. He turned his head slightly, eyes darting toward the voices. The weight of the situation was settling in, creeping under his skin. And for the first time in years, a slow, Cold realization gripped him. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. By the time Craig Holt walked into the station that night, he had already convinced himself that what happened on Willow Avenue was nothing more than an inconvenience. He had handled worse. A few angry onlookers, some shaky phone footage, nothing he hadn't seen before. By morning, it would be forgotten, just like every other time. But across town, inside a small apartment cluttered with stacks of old newspapers and coffee-stained notebooks, Lisa Carter stared at her phone screen, her pulse racing. The video had been sent to her anonymously. A grainy but unmistakable clip of a uniformed officer striking a woman across the face. At first, Lisa didn't react. In Ashton, these things happened, and too often. No one cared. But then she saw the woman's face. Commissioner Monroe. Lisa's instincts kicked in. She uploaded the video to Twitter, adding a short caption. Ashton PD officer assaults a black woman during a traffic stop. Except this time, she's his boss. Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. By sunrise, it had 100,000. Major news outlets picked it up. Calls flooded the Ashton Police Department. Commentators debated it on morning talk shows. Was this another case of abuse of power? Racial bias? A commissioner trying to make a name for herself? Holt saw the headlines when he stopped at the gas station for coffee. He skimmed the comments on his phone, shaking his head. The usual noise. He wasn't worried. Back at the station, he filled out his report the way he always did, by making sure the truth worked in his favor. He wrote that Commissioner Monroe had been erratic, refusing to comply. He described her as aggressive, creating a scenario where he had been forced to defend himself. He handed the paperwork to Chief James Rourke without a second thought. Rourke barely looked up. He was a thick-set man in his late 50s. His silver hair neatly combed back. He had been with the force longer than most men had been alive. And he wore that history like a badge of honor. "We have a problem," Holt said, taking a seat across from him. Rourke glanced at the paper, then at Holt. "No, you have a problem." Holt smirked. "Come on, Jim. This isn't the first time a video's made the rounds. Give it a day, maybe two, and the media will move on to something else." Rourke leaned back, rubbing his temple. That was before social media could tear down an entire career overnight. Holt shrugged. "That's why I need you to keep this under control. Same as always." Rourke exhaled slowly, then nodded. "We'll handle it." Holt left the office feeling reassured. Across town, Monroe sat alone in her dimly lit living room, staring at her phone. The calls hadn't stopped. Some were from reporters, others from allies warning her to tread carefully. Then a number she didn't recognize flashed across the screen. She hesitated before answering. "Commissioner Monroe." The voice on the other end said. It was deep, steady. "Who is this?" she asked. "A friend." A pause. "You should know that Holt is just a symptom of a bigger disease. They won't let you in." She sat up, her pulse quickening. "Who is they?" But the line went dead. Monroe exhaled, setting the phone down. She had spent her entire career facing obstacles. But this was different. This wasn't just about Holt. She was up against something much bigger. The following morning, the official statement from the Ashton Police Department was released. It claimed that Commissioner Monroe had violated traffic laws and behaved in a manner unbecoming of an officer. The department announced that she would be placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. Holt read the statement with satisfaction. What he didn't know was that another video existed. One from a different angle. Clearer, unedited. And it was about to change everything. The morning air in Ashton carried a tense, electric charge. The night before, the police department's statement had been met with predictable outrage. But Holt still felt confident that things would blow over. That confidence cracked the moment he stepped into the station and saw half a dozen officers clustered around their phones, whispering. Something was wrong. He pushed through the group and caught a glimpse of the screen one of them held. The video was playing again, but this wasn't the same shaky, distant clip that had gone viral the night before. This was different, closer. The angle was tighter, the audio sharper. Monroe's voice was clear, steady, asking a simple question. Why was she being stopped? Holt's own voice followed, curt and dismissive. Then came the moment that made his stomach turn. The slap. There was no resisting, no aggression from Monroe, just his hand striking her face. her head snapping to the side. And then, her unwavering stare, cutting through the moment like a knife. This wasn't a minor controversy anymore. This was damning. Across town, Monroe stood in her office, watching the same clip on her laptop. Her phone buzzed with messages, calls from reporters, texts from allies, even a few threats. She ignored most of them. One message stood out. Marcus Tate, a well-known civil rights attorney, had gone on air that morning, calling for a full investigation. He wasn't just another talking head. Tate had a reputation for tearing corrupt police departments apart. Case by case, lawsuit by lawsuit, his words carried weight. This is not just another abuse of power, he said to the camera, his expression severe. This is a direct attack on the integrity of law enforcement. If Ashton's leadership thinks they can sweep this under the rug, they're making a grave mistake. Monroe watched in silence. This wasn't just about her anymore. The battle had escalated. Holt stormed into Rourke's office without knocking. "We've got a problem," he said. Rourke, who had been reviewing paperwork with his reading glasses perched low on his nose, barely looked up. "No, Holt, you have a problem." Holt clenched his fists. "I need protection. You saw the video. That lawyer, Tate, is already calling for my head. We need to control this." Rourke finally set down his pen and sighed. "The way we control this is by taking Monroe off the board. She's the reason this is still in the news cycle." A cold smile crept onto Holt's face. "So, what's the move?" Rourke leaned back. "Effective immediately. Monroe is placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation." Holt exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. "Good. That should slow things down." Rourke didn't look as convinced. Monroe had expected this move. She didn't react when the official notice was handed to her that afternoon. She read it once, folded it, and placed it on her desk. "You're not going to fight it?" The officer delivering it shifted uncomfortably. Monroe looked up, a small, knowing smile forming. "Not today." She had another fight to prepare for. Lisa Carter's office was cluttered with stacks of research, notes scrawled in the margins of legal documents, and a whiteboard covered in red marker scribbles. She barely looked up when Monroe entered. "So," Lisa said, leaning back in her chair, "they suspended you." Monroe nodded. Lisa tapped her pen against her desk. "I assume that means you're not here to play defense." Monroe took a seat across from her. "I want to expose Holt. Everything." Lisa studied her for a long moment, then stood and rummaged through a pile of folders. She pulled one free and tossed it onto the desk. "I've been looking into him for months." The slap was just the latest in a long history of. She hesitated. Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Lisa exhaled. 2 years ago, a man named Samuel Hargrove was taken into custody after a bar fight. He never made it out. Monroe felt a chill creep up her spine. "You're saying Holt?" "I'm saying the autopsy ruled it a pre-existing condition. I'm saying the security footage from that night went missing. And I'm saying the only witness recanted his statement after spending a weekend in lockup for unrelated charges." Monroe sat back, her mind racing. Holt wasn't just an officer with a short temper. He was dangerous, and if Rourke had been covering for him, that meant this ran deeper than she had feared. Lisa leaned forward. "You really want to take him down?" Monroe met her gaze. "I do." That night, Monroe returned home to find a thick envelope shoved under her front door. No name, no return address. She locked the door behind her and opened it carefully. Inside was a stack of internal police documents, reports, disciplinary records, complaints. Some were about Holt, others were about officers she barely recognized. At the bottom of the pile was a single, handwritten note. "You're looking in the right places. Keep going." Someone inside the department had sent this. Someone who either wanted justice, or had their own reasons for wanting Holt to fall. Either way, Monroe knew one thing. She wasn't alone in this fight. Holt sat at his desk, fingers tapping against the wood as he watched the news play in the background. The media had shifted gears. This morning, they weren't just talking about his actions anymore. They were talking about her. A conservative news anchor leaned forward, eyebrows raised in mock concern. "It turns out Commissioner Monroe isn't as clean as she wants people to believe. A new report alleges financial misconduct from her time in Atlanta. If true, This raises serious questions about whether she's fit to lead Ashton's police department. Holt smirked. It had been easy. He and Captain Carl Briggs had spent years perfecting this kind of counterattack. Monroe thought she could take them down with one viral video? She had no idea how this game was played. Briggs had pulled some old paperwork. Just enough to make Monroe look dirty. A falsified whistleblower complaint. A vague financial inconsistency from her time in Atlanta. Exaggerated just enough to make headlines. The story didn't need to be airtight. It just needed to spread fast. And it was working. Holt glanced at Briggs, who was watching the same broadcast from across the room. The older man nodded approvingly. That should keep her occupied. Briggs muttered. Holt leaned back, exhaling. Let's see how she handles being on the other side of the interrogation table. Monroe had expected pushback, but not this fast, not this ruthless. She sat in her kitchen, phone pressed against her ear as Marcus Tate's voice came through, low and urgent. You can't let this sit. Erica, if you don't hit back now, they'll turn you into the villain before you can get the truth out. She rubbed her temple. They're throwing everything they have at me. If I chase down every lie, I'll never get ahead of this. You don't have a choice. Marcus said. Holt has backup. He knows how to make people disappear. Erica. Metaphorically and literally. A chill ran down her spine. Then her second phone. An unlisted number she rarely used. Buzzed on the counter. I have to call you back, she told Marcus, ending the call. She hesitated before answering. Commissioner Monroe, a voice said. It was male, cautious, uncertain. Who is this? The line was silent for a beat. Then, someone who can help you. Meet me at the old parking garage on 9th. Level 3. Bring no one. The call ended. She stared at the phone for a long moment before grabbing her coat. Monroe pulled into the nearly abandoned garage just after midnight. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, restless shadows across the concrete. A man stood near the railing, hands in his pockets. He turned as she approached. Patrick Evans. She recognized him immediately. One of the younger officers. Someone who had always kept his head down. She had never given him much thought before. You're the one who called? She asked. He nodded. She studied him. Why? Evans shifted uncomfortably. Because I've seen too much. And I can't unsee it anymore. She didn't respond. Waiting. He swallowed hard. Holt isn't just dirty, he's careful. He knows how to erase things. But I've been watching. I have proof. He pulled a small USB drive from his jacket and handed it to her. What's on this? She asked. A backup of the department's security footage. The real footage. He looked around, lowering his voice. Holt's been covering up incidents for years. He deleted footage of an arrest 2 months ago where he beat a suspect unconscious. That video was supposed to be destroyed. Monroe's grip tightened around the USB. Evans exhaled sharply. I don't know who else to trust. But I know I can't sit on this. She nodded. You're doing the right thing. A low rumble echoed through the garage. Evans turned toward the ramp leading down to the exit. A pair of headlights appeared. Moving fast. Too fast. Monroe's pulse jumped. Patrick, move, she shouted. The truck hit him before he could react. The sickening crunch of metal and bone filled the garage as Evans's body was thrown backward. Skidding across the pavement. The vehicle didn't stop. It roared down the ramp and disappeared into the night. Monroe ran to Evans, dropping to her knees. Blood pooled beneath him, his breaths shallow. He grasped at her wrist, trying to speak. You're not alone, he choked out. Then his hand fell limp. Monroe sat there, heart hammering, as the reality of what just happened settled in. This wasn't just about Holt anymore. Something bigger was moving in the shadows. And whoever they were, they had just sent her a message. Monroe's hands were slick with Patrick Evans's blood as she pressed down on his wound. Her mind racing against the inevitable. The sound of her own heartbeat thudded in her ears as she grabbed her phone and called 911. She barely managed to get the words out before the dispatcher cut in. There's already a unit on the way. That was too fast, too convenient. She looked down at Patrick, whose chest was rising and falling in short, ragged breaths. His lips moved, but the words barely made a sound. What? She asked, leaning closer. His fingers twitched, gripping her sleeve weakly. Don't trust? Then, his body went slack. A minute later, the first squad car rolled up. 2 officers stepped out, neither of them moving with urgency. One knelt beside Patrick, feeling for a pulse with all the enthusiasm of a man checking his watch. "Looks bad," he said flatly. Monroe's patience snapped. "He needs an ambulance now." The second officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, barely spared her a glance as he pulled out a notepad. "And you said this was a hit and run?" "I didn't say anything yet," Monroe shot back. The officer hummed as if he hadn't heard her. "Yeah, looks like a case of reckless driving. Probably some drunk coming off the highway too fast." Her stomach tightened. They weren't just stalling. They were burying this. Patrick Evans wasn't an innocent bystander. He had dirt on Holt, on Rourke, and someone had made sure he wouldn't live long enough to share it. Monroe stepped back, fists clenched. This wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. There was something bigger at play. And she was running out of time. Monroe locked her apartment door and pulled the USB from her pocket, staring at it for a long moment before finally inserting it into her laptop. The screen flickered as the files loaded. There were dozens of folders, all labeled with dates stretching back years. She clicked on the most recent one and a grainy video played. A dimly lit interrogation room. A suspect, a black man in his early 20s, sat slumped in a chair, handcuffed, a bruise already forming on his cheek. Across from him, Holt stood with his arms crossed. The audio kicked in. "Resisting arrest." "Huh?" Holt's voice was calm, casual. "That's what we're calling it now." The man barely lifted his head. I didn't do anything." A hard slap cut him off. Monroe's stomach churned as the video continued. Holt didn't stop with one hit. He struck the man again, and again, until the suspect was barely conscious. Then, a new figure stepped into frame. James Rourke. The police chief didn't seem surprised. He didn't stop Holt. He simply pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned to the security camera. A second later, the footage cut to static. Monroe exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening into fists. This wasn't just a case of a rogue officer abusing his power. Holt had been protected, encouraged. Rourke hadn't just looked the other way. He had made sure no one would ever see this. And now, she had the proof. Monroe paced her apartment, phone in hand, debating her next move. Lisa Carter had already been trying to expose Holt. If Monroe gave her this footage, it would be everywhere by morning. But there was a problem. The video had been obtained illegally. If she released it, Rourke could argue it was inadmissible in court. Worse, he could turn the narrative against her, claiming she had tampered with evidence. She needed a smarter approach. Lisa picked up on the second ring. "Tell me you've got something," the journalist said, skipping the formalities. "I have video proof that Rourke personally ordered evidence to be destroyed." Lisa let out a low whistle. "That's nuclear. When do we drop it?" Monroe hesitated. "We can't, not yet." "Are you serious?" Lisa's voice sharpened. "This is the kind of thing that brings down entire departments." "I know," Monroe said, gripping the phone tighter. "But if we drop it now, Rourke will spin it against me. He'll claim it was doctored, or that I obtained it illegally. We need a way to make it stick." Lisa was quiet for a moment. "So what's the play?" Monroe glanced at the USB still plugged into her laptop. "We need someone on the inside to authenticate this," she said. "Someone with enough credibility that Rourke can't just dismiss it." Lisa sighed. "That's not going to be easy." "No," Monroe agreed. "But I think we just made this war official." The next morning, Monroe woke to her phone buzzing relentlessly. She groggily grabbed it, expecting more messages about Patrick's attack. Instead, she saw her name plastered across every news outlet. A leaked internal report, claims of financial misconduct, allegations that she had accepted money from an outside group with a political agenda. She barely heard the details as she scrolled through the headlines. They were coming for her. Holt and Rourke were flipping the script, making her the villain, and if she didn't strike back fast, they would crush her before she ever got the chance. Monroe sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Rourke had the upper hand for now, but she wasn't going to let him bury her without a fight. She needed allies, ones that weren't tied to the corrupt system she was trying to dismantle. There was only one person who came to mind: Marcus Tate. She had met Tate years ago during a civil rights case in Atlanta. He had built his reputation taking on cases that most lawyers wouldn't touch: wrongful convictions, police brutality, institutional racism. If there was anyone who could help her navigate the legal and political storm ahead, it was him. She dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said, his voice smooth but edged with concern. "I saw the news. I don't have time for small talk." "Marcus," she said, "I need your help." "Then you better come see me," he replied, "and bring everything you've got." An hour later, Monroe walked into Tate's office. A modest space lined with case files and framed newspaper clippings of his victories. Behind his desk sat a man in his late 50s, sharp-eyed, with a salt and pepper beard. "Damn, Erica," he said, shaking his head, "they're coming at you from every direction." She dropped a flash drive onto his desk. "And I'm about to hit back." Tate inserted the drive into his laptop and watched the footage, his face darkening with each passing second. "This is bad," he muttered. "Rourke isn't just covering for Holt. He's running the whole damn operation." Monroe folded her arms. "So, what's the play?" Tate leaned back in his chair. "If this was just Holt, I'd say take it to the press and let public pressure do the work. But Rourke? He's got connections. If we don't play this right, he'll turn this around on you before you even step into a courtroom." Monroe clenched her jaw. "Then we need something stronger. Someone who can expose him from the inside." Tate exhaled through his nose, thinking. Then, as if a light flicked on in his mind, he reached for his phone. "There's someone you need to meet," he said. "Robert Gaines." The name was familiar. Gaines was a former FBI agent who had spent years investigating police corruption. He had built airtight cases against dirty cops, only for the system to let them walk free. Frustrated, he had left the bureau. But his name still carried weight. Tate arranged the meeting, and a few hours later, Monroe found herself in a dimly lit diner across from a man who looked like he had seen too much. Gaines was in his early 60s, his graying hair cropped short, his posture rigid, his eyes, though tired, missed nothing. "You've got a hell of a problem," he said, sipping his black coffee. "But I'm guessing you already knew that." Monroe pushed the flash drive toward him. "I have evidence, but I need to make sure it sticks." Gaines plugged in a small pair of reading glasses and watched the footage, his face unreadable. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "This is good, but it won't be enough to take Rourke down." "Not yet." Monroe frowned. "Why not?" Gaines set his cup down. "Because Rourke's been at this for decades. You think this is the only time he's destroyed evidence? If we're going to take him down, we need more than a single video. We need a pattern, a history." Monroe leaned forward. "And you know where to find it?" Gaines nodded. "I've been tracking cases tied to Rourke for years. But I never had a smoking gun. Now, with your video, we might be able to connect the dots." Monroe felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since this started, she had a path forward. But first, she had to face Rourke. Monroe didn't bother knocking when she entered Rourke's office. The police chief looked up from his desk, his expression cold but unsurprised. "You look like a woman with something to say," he said. Monroe threw the flash drive onto his desk. "You've been destroying evidence, covering for Holt. I have it all on video." Rourke didn't even flinch. He simply leaned back in his chair and smirked. "And?" Monroe narrowed her eyes. "You're going to resign. You're going to take Holt down with you. Or I'll release this to the press." Rourke chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? You think a little video is enough to bring me down? You think people in this town care?" Monroe gritted her teeth. "When they see what you've done, they will." Rourke reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. He slid it across the desk toward her. "Go ahead, open it." Monroe hesitated, then flipped the folder open. Her blood went cold. Inside were copies of documents, emails, financial records, transaction logs, all pointing to one thing: a claim that Monroe had accepted money from an outside group, a nonprofit known for funding civil rights cases. On paper, it looked like bribery, a conflict of interest, a manufactured scandal. Rourke smiled. "Now, you and I both know this is bullshit. But the public?" He leaned in. "They're going to see exactly what I tell them to see." Monroe clenched her fists. But before she could respond, the door opened. Holt walked in, his smirk widening as he saw her. "I don't know what you're planning," he said, his tone dripping with mock concern. "But I really hope you're careful." Rourke folded his hands. "This town doesn't work like the big cities. Commissioner, we don't let outsiders come in and change the rules." Monroe took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She had walked in thinking she could take them down with a single blow. She had underestimated them, but they had underestimated her too. She glanced at the small device clipped to the inside of her jacket. It had been recording the entire conversation. She turned on her heel and walked out without another word. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Monroe's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she glanced into the rearview mirror. The black sedan had been following her for the past 10 minutes. Matching her every turn, keeping its distance but never far enough to be a coincidence. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Paranoia could be dangerous, but so was ignoring the obvious. Instead of heading straight home, she made a last-second turn. Pulling into a crowded gas station, she parked near the entrance, where the security cameras could get a clear view of her car. She waited, pretending to scroll through her phone. The sedan rolled past but didn't stop. Monroe memorized the plate number before it disappeared into the night. After a few minutes, she started the car again and drove home. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave her. When she pulled into her driveway, her security lights flicked on, illuminating the front of her house. Everything looked normal, but Monroe had learned a long time ago that normal was often an illusion. She went inside and immediately checked the security cameras. She rewound the footage from earlier that evening. And there it was, a shadowy figure lurking near her backyard fence. They had been careful, staying just out of range of the motion sensors. No clear face, no identifiable clothing, just a presence. Monroe's stomach tightened. Someone had been watching her. Then she saw it, a white envelope, wedged under her front door. Heart pounding, she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Her and Lisa Carter, sitting in the diner 2 nights ago. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but the message scrawled beneath it in thick black ink was crystal clear. "Stop before it's too late." She exhaled slowly. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. They wanted her to know they were watching. She folded the note and slid it into a drawer, her mind already working through her next move. Whoever left this message had made one mistake. They thought fear would stop her. It wouldn't. The next day, Monroe sat in her office at home, going through files when her phone buzzed. A restricted number. She answered cautiously. "You should come alone." A male voice said, "I have something for you." Monroe's fingers tightened around the phone. "Who is this?" The line went dead. She considered ignoring it. It screamed of a setup. But something about the voice, it had been rushed, almost nervous. If this was real, she couldn't afford to ignore it. She grabbed her coat and drove out, her instincts on high alert. The meeting point was a parking garage downtown, the kind of place where bad things happened in the shadows. She stepped out of the car, scanning the area. Empty, too empty. Then the floodlights came on, and she was surrounded. 4 officers in uniform, their hands resting near their holsters. And standing at the front, arms crossed, was Craig Holt. Monroe didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched him. Holt smirked. "Commissioner Monroe, fancy seeing you here." She remained still, her eyes sharp. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." "Oh, I don't think so," Holt said, stepping closer. "You see, someone tipped us off. Apparently, you've been stealing classified documents from the department." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "You're accusing me of a crime without evidence? That's bold, even for you." Holt's smirk widened. "Who needs evidence when you have the right friends?" The other officers closed in, and Monroe saw it now. This wasn't an arrest. This was intimidation. A message. They wanted to make her feel powerless. But Monroe had come prepared. As one officer reached for her arm, she subtly pressed the small button on her wristwatch. A recording device activated. Holt leaned in, his voice just above a whisper. "You really should stop digging. Things tend to go wrong for people who don't know when to quit." Monroe didn't flinch. "Is that a threat, Officer Holt?" He chuckled. "Oh, I don't make threats. I make promises. The officers flanked her, leading her toward one of their cruisers. No official arrest, no paperwork, just a quiet disappearance. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Monroe's mind. They weren't just trying to intimidate her. They were making her disappear. Then, a voice echoed through the garage. Stand down. The officers turned, startled. A young officer stepped forward. His badge read Daniel Reyes. Per state law, any department-level arrest must be processed with a warrant. Reyes said, his voice firm despite the tension in the air. And I don't see a warrant. Holt's jaw tightened. Reyes, this doesn't concern you. Reyes didn't back down. Actually, it does. I just submitted an internal complaint to the State Inspector General. Any further action against Commissioner Monroe could be considered retaliation. A long silence. Then Holt chuckled, shaking his head. You just made a very dangerous enemy. Kid. Reyes didn't blink. So did you. Monroe felt the shift. Holt couldn't move forward without making things worse for himself. Finally, he sighed, stepping back. Let her go. The officers hesitated before stepping away. Monroe adjusted her coat, meeting Holt's gaze one last time. You're running out of time, she said, her voice even. And you know it. Holt didn't respond. Monroe turned, walking toward her car, her pulse steady. She had just survived their first real attempt to destroy her. But she knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't stop here. Monroe sat in her dimly lit office, her fingers drumming against the wooden desk. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed on her shoulders. But she had no time to dwell on fear. Holt and Rourke had made their move. Now it was her turn. She pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus Tate. The civil rights attorney picked up after the first ring. I take it you're not calling just to check in, Marcus said, his voice laced with concern. I need to meet. Now, Monroe replied. We need a real strategy. They arranged to meet at a discreet location. A small cafe on the outskirts of town. Away from prying eyes. When Monroe arrived, Lisa Carter was already there, sipping coffee, her eyes scanning the room. Monroe slid into the booth, lowering her voice. They're getting desperate. She placed a folded note on the table, the same one she had found under her door. Lisa frowned, reading the words. Stop before it's too late. She exhaled sharply. That's a warning, or a promise. They set me up yesterday. Monroe continued. It didn't work, but they're going to try again. We can't just play defense anymore. Marcus nodded. Then we need to hit them where it hurts. Lisa's phone buzzed. She checked the screen and her eyes widened. I just got an email from someone calling themselves Shadow. Monroe leaned in. What did it say? Lisa turned the screen toward them. I have financial records linking Rourke to illegal activities. If you want the truth, be ready. I'll be in touch. Monroe exchanged a glance with Marcus. This could be exactly what we need, Marcus said. If Rourke's involved in something bigger than just covering up police brutality, if we can prove financial corruption, this won't just be an internal scandal. It'll bring in the state, maybe even the feds. Monroe's mind raced. If Rourke goes down, so does Holt. But we need more than just anonymous tips. Lisa nodded. I'll push Shadow for specifics. But if this is real, we might finally have the leverage we need. Monroe sat back, taking a deep breath. For the first time in days, she felt like they weren't just surviving. They were starting to fight back. That evening, Monroe met Marcus in his office. The room was cluttered with case files, legal briefs, and framed pictures of past civil rights victories. I ran a background check on Rourke, Marcus said, sliding a folder across the desk. The guy's got a long history. But nothing ever sticks. He's been accused of misconduct before. But every case disappeared before it could go anywhere. Monroe flipped through the pages. Photos, reports, allegations. Each one a thread in a web of corruption. Then there's this, Marcus added, pulling out another document. Rourke has been making large wire transfers to an account linked to a shell company. The company has ties to a known criminal organization. Monroe's grip tightened on the folder. If we can prove this, she said, we're not just looking at a police scandal. We're looking at racketeering, organized crime. Something big enough to bring the entire system down. Marcus nodded. But getting hard evidence won't be easy. Monroe exhaled. We need someone inside, Lisa had been working late, sifting through documents at her apartment when she got the message. Meet me. No cops. No Monroe. Just you. Attached was an address. She hesitated. It could be a trap. But if it wasn't? She grabbed her bag and left. The meeting point was a quiet parking lot behind an abandoned office building. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Lisa pulled her coat tighter around herself as she stepped out of her car. A figure emerged from the darkness. Officer Daniel Reyes. Lisa's shoulders relaxed slightly, but only slightly. I didn't think you'd show, she said. Reyes glanced around before speaking. I don't have much time. What do you have? Reyes pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to her. It's a list of officers involved in evidence tampering. If this gets out, I'm a dead man. Lisa's pulse quickened as she read the names. Some of them she expected. Others, she didn't. This is huge, she whispered. We can use this. Reyes' expression darkened. If you do, make sure it counts. Because once this gets out, they'll come after everyone. Lisa nodded. We'll protect you. Reyes scoffed. No one can protect me. Before she could respond, a noise echoed through the alley. Footsteps. Lisa turned just as two masked men rushed toward her. She barely had time to react before she felt a hard shove against her shoulder. Her bag flew from her grasp, landing on the pavement. The USB drive, the one Reyes had just given her, was inside. One of the men grabbed it while the other struck her across the face. Lisa hit the ground, pain exploding through her skull. She heard Reyes shout, but then there was another thud. Reyes being thrown against the wall. And then, silence. By the time Lisa lifted her head, the men were gone, and so was the evidence. Monroe's phone buzzed in the middle of the night. It was Lisa. Lisa? Monroe answered. What's wrong? Lisa's voice was shaky. They took it. The USB, the list, everything. Monroe sat up straight, every muscle tensing. How bad is it? Lisa hesitated. Bad. Monroe closed her eyes. She had known they would push back. She just hadn't expected them to move this fast. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing Lisa Carter registered as she slowly regained consciousness. The room was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of the hospital hallway spilling through the slightly open door. A dull ache pulsed at the side of her head, a cruel reminder of what had happened. She blinked, trying to clear the fog from her mind. As her vision adjusted, she saw a figure sitting near the foot of her bed. Monroe, Lisa murmured, her voice hoarse. Erica Monroe leaned forward, relief flickering across her face, though her eyes remained sharp and calculating. You're lucky, she said, a little worse, and you wouldn't be waking up in a hospital. You'd be in the morgue. Lisa let out a humorless chuckle, then winced. Did they take it? Monroe nodded grimly. The USB is gone. Lisa closed her eyes, frustration curling through her. Damn it, that was our best shot. We'll find another way, Monroe assured her. But first, I need you to remember everything you can. Anything unusual before the attack? Someone following you? Lisa thought back. The memories disjointed. Reyes was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, like he knew something was coming. He told me there was someone inside the department, someone watching us. Monroe frowned. Did he say who? No, Lisa muttered, but he was scared. Monroe sat back, digesting the information. Someone inside Ashton PD had been keeping tabs on them. Someone powerful enough to make people disappear. And now, that someone had their evidence. The next morning, Officer Daniel Reyes walked into Monroe's office, his usual confidence replaced by unease. He shut the door behind him and stood there for a moment, fingers drumming nervously against his belt. Monroe gestured toward a chair. Sit. Reyes hesitated before lowering himself onto the edge of the seat. He pulled a small plastic evidence bag from his pocket and slid it across the desk. Inside was a single bullet. They left it on my desk, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe studied it, her jaw tightening. It's a warning, Reyes continued. They know I helped you. I should have seen this coming. Monroe's eyes didn't leave the bullet. Who's they? Reyes exhaled sharply. That's the problem. I don't know exactly who. But I do know someone inside the department is feeding Holt and Rourke information. Someone high up. Monroe leaned forward, her voice steady. If we don't stop them, it won't just be your job on the line. It'll be your life. Reyes swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. I need to know if you're in or out. Monroe pressed. A long silence stretched between them before Reyes finally nodded. I'm in, but we have to be smart. Monroe offered a tight smile. Then let's set a trap. Later that evening, Monroe, Lisa, and Marcus Tate sat at a corner table in a quiet cafe. Their heads bent together in hushed discussion. Monroe outlined the plan. We stage a leak, make it seem like we still have a backup of the USB. Whoever is working with Holt and Rourke will take the bait. Lisa nodded. I can, accidentally, let it slip in an article that Marcus and I recovered a second copy. Something vague, but just enough to draw them out. Marcus tapped his fingers against the table. And what happens when they take the bait? Monroe's expression darkened. We find out who they are. The next morning, Lisa published a short online piece hinting that her team had retrieved new evidence related to corruption in Ashton PD. The article spread fast, circulating in both activist and legal circles. They didn't have to wait long for a response. Less than an hour later, Monroe received a message from one of her informants. Holt had been spotted heading toward a secluded alley downtown. Monroe and Lisa rushed to the scene, parking discreetly across the street. From their vantage point, they saw Holt pacing near a dumpster, his posture tense. Minutes later, another man stepped into the alley. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a crisp suit that barely concealed the bulk of his muscle. Lisa's breath hitched. That's Captain Carl Briggs. Monroe's stomach turned cold. Briggs wasn't just another officer. He was Rourke's right-hand man, responsible for overseeing internal affairs investigations, which meant he had access to all confidential files. If he was here, it meant he was the leak. Lisa pulled out her phone and discreetly snapped a photo of the two men. Holt handed Briggs a small envelope. Monroe narrowed her eyes. They're exchanging something. Lisa lowered her phone. What now? Monroe exhaled slowly. Now we hit them where it hurts. Lisa Carter sat in front of her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The weight of what she was about to publish settled heavy on her shoulders. This wasn't just another article, it was a declaration of war. Across from her, Monroe paced the small apartment, her arms crossed. You ready? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Lisa exhaled, then nodded. It's all here. Holt, Rourke, Briggs. Their ties, their cover-ups, the whole system they've built. The audio file is embedded. Once I hit publish, there's no taking it back. Monroe stopped pacing. Good. Do it. Lisa clicked the button. Within seconds, the article was live. Within minutes, it was being shared at a blistering speed. At the same time, an encrypted email made its way to the FBI's internal server. Attached was the recorded conversation between Monroe and Rourke, where he had threatened to ruin her career. An agent named Jacob Calloway listened to the file, his expression darkening. He knew corruption in small-town police departments was common. But this was systemic. And now, it was public. He picked up the phone. We need to send a team to Ashton, he said. Captain Carl Briggs slammed his fist against his desk. His office door was closed, but he could still hear the chaos erupting outside. Phones ringing non-stop, reporters swarming the building. Holt stood by the window, arms crossed. You're losing it, Carl. Briggs turned, his face red. You don't get it, do you? This is bigger than just you roughing up some commissioner. This is Rourke. This is everything we built. Holt scoffed. So what? The media runs a few hit pieces. And you're already rolling over? You sound scared. Briggs stepped forward, his jaw clenched. I'm not scared. I'm practical. And I'm telling you, if we don't distance ourselves from Rourke, we go down with him. Holt smirked. You do what you need to do. But I'm not backing off. Briggs exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. You're a damn fool, Craig. That evening, a press conference was held at Ashton City Hall. James Rourke stood at the podium, his usual authoritative demeanor slightly strained. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone. In light of recent allegations, he began, I have decided to step down temporarily to allow a full and transparent investigation into these claims. Monroe watched from a distance, standing near the back of the crowd. She wasn't surprised. Rourke wasn't admitting defeat, he was buying time. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "I need to talk. I have information that can take Holt down for good." Attached was a name. Daryl Hopkins. Monroe's pulse quickened. Hopkins was a former cop. One of Holt's old partners before he left the force under mysterious circumstances. If he had evidence, this could be it. She typed back. "Where?" Seconds later, a reply came. "Midnight. The old train station. Come alone." Monroe exhaled slowly. She knew this was a risk. But if Hopkins was telling the truth, she might finally have the last piece she needed. Holt sat alone in his car, parked at the edge of a vacant lot just outside town. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The engine hummed, but he didn't move. The town was turning against him. The media was relentless. Monroe had pushed the FBI into action. And now, Daryl Hopkins, the one man who knew too much, had resurfaced. Holt pulled out his phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd have to use. The call rang twice before Rourke answered. "What do you want, Craig?" His voice was cold, detached. "You know what I want." Holt hissed. "They're closing in on me. I need help." There was silence on the other end. Then Rourke exhaled, slow and deliberate. "I can't do anything for you," he said. "You're on your own." Holt's grip on the phone tightened. "Bullshit. You wouldn't be where you were without me. I did your dirty work. I kept the streets in line. And now you're sloppy." Rourke cut in. "And you got caught. I'm not going down with you." The line went dead. Holt threw the phone against the dashboard, cursing under his breath. At the FBI field office in Atlanta, Special Agent Jacob Calloway reviewed the latest reports coming out of Ashton. The evidence was overwhelming. Holt wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was the linchpin of an entire network of misconduct. Calloway turned to one of his junior agents. "Put out the order. I want Holt in custody before the end of the night." Across town, Lisa Carter's latest article had just gone live. The headline was brutal. "Holt's Dirty Deals. How One Officer Turned Law Enforcement into a Business." The piece detailed how Holt had been protecting a local criminal syndicate in exchange for kickbacks. Testimonies from former officers, some anonymous, some not, painted a picture of a man who had long ago abandoned any pretense of justice. The backlash was immediate. By sunset, people had gathered outside the Ashton police station, holding signs, chanting for justice. The mayor, under immense pressure, issued a public statement demanding Holt's immediate suspension. Holt had one option left. He had a stash of cash, emergency money he had been keeping for years. He packed a duffel bag, shoved it in the trunk, and took one last look at his house. It wouldn't be there when he came back, if he ever did. He climbed into his car and started driving. But as he reached the outskirts of town, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. The car had been following him for miles. He changed lanes. The car followed. Holt clenched his jaw. Then, red and blue lights flashed. He slammed his foot on the gas. But before he could get far, a black SUV cut him off. He yanked the wheel, trying to swerve, but lost control. The car skidded off the road, crashing into a concrete barrier with a sickening crunch. Pain exploded in his ribs. His vision blurred. The door was yanked open, and through the haze, he saw Officer Daniel Reyes standing over him, gun drawn. "You're done," Reyes said. More lights, more sirens. SWAT officers swarmed in. The last thing Holt saw before they dragged him out of the wreckage was a sea of cameras flashing. It was over. Briggs sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, his hands clasped together. He wasn't wearing his uniform anymore, just a wrinkled button-up shirt and slacks. Across from him, Special Agent Jacob Calloway placed a thick folder on the table and leaned forward. "You know why you're here, Briggs," Calloway said, flipping open the folder. "You've got two choices. Go down with Rourke or help us bring him in." Briggs exhaled slowly, his eyes darting toward the mirrored wall. He knew Rourke was powerful, but after seeing Holt fall, he wasn't willing to take that risk. "I want a deal," he muttered. "Witness protection. I give you everything." Calloway exchanged a glance with the agent standing beside him. Then, he slid a notepad across the table. "Start writing." Across town, Monroe stood on the steps of City Hall, watching the growing crowd. People held up signs demanding accountability, calling for a full-scale investigation into the Ashton Police Department. The energy was electric, like a town waking up after years of silence. Lisa Carter stood beside her, phone in hand, checking updates. Briggs gave them everything, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Money trails, signed documents, even an audio recording of Rourke approving a payoff. Monroe let out a slow breath. It's over. Lisa frowned. Maybe, but you know how men like Rourke operate. He won't go down without a fight. At the Ashton Police Department, Rourke sat in his office, watching a press conference on his laptop. The governor had just announced a full audit of the department's finances. His face was blank, but his fingers drummed rapidly against the desk. His phone rang. He picked it up without checking the caller ID. We have a problem, a voice on the other end said. Briggs flipped. Rourke closed his eyes. That coward. There's still time. The voice continued. We can control the narrative. But you need to act now. Rourke hung up and stood, straightening his tie. He reached for his coat and stepped outside his office, where a line of reporters was already waiting. The press conference was packed. Cameras flashed. The air was thick with anticipation. Rourke stood behind the podium, eyes scanning the room. These accusations are politically motivated, he announced. I have served this community for decades. The real criminals are the people orchestrating this smear campaign against law enforcement. Monroe, watching from the crowd, shook her head. He was going to fight until the very last second. But then, movement at the back of the room. FBI agents entered quietly, moving with precision. The lead agent walked straight to the front, pulling out a warrant. James Rourke, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, cameras snapped wildly. Monroe watched as Rourke's face remained eerily calm, even as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. As they led him past her, he leaned in just slightly. His voice was low but sharp. You think you've won? He whispered. This system doesn't change. She didn't flinch. She met his eyes, steady and unwavering. The system doesn't change, she said, but the people in it can. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators sat in silence. Journalists lined the back with notepads and cameras. And the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. At the center of it all, Craig Holt sat at the defense table, clad in an orange jumpsuit. His usual arrogance had dimmed, but his eyes still held defiance. At the prosecution's table, Erica Monroe sat beside Assistant District Attorney Melanie Carter. Her hands folded. She had fought too hard for this moment. All rise. The bailiff called. Judge Leonard Stanton, a stern-looking man in his 60s, entered and took his seat. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at the documents in front of him. We will begin the trial of Craig Holt, charged with multiple counts of excessive force, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The case had begun. Daniel Reyes was the first to take the stand. He looked nervous but determined as he took his oath and sat down. Officer Reyes, Ada Carter began. Can you describe the culture within the Ashton Police Department under Craig Holt and James Rourke? Reyes swallowed hard. It wasn't about protecting people. It was about control. Holt and Rourke made sure anyone who questioned them was silenced. If you didn't follow their lead, your career was over. Carter nodded. And did you witness Holt falsifying reports? Yes, Reyes said. He tampered with evidence, altered witness statements, and made sure complaints against him disappeared. Holt's lawyer, Richard Langston, stood. Objection. Speculation. Overruled. Judge Stanton said, the witness can continue. Reyes exhaled. Holt thought he was untouchable. He wasn't just a bad cop. He was a criminal in uniform. Monroe watched as the jury shifted uncomfortably. The truth was sinking in. Darryl Hopkins was next. Unlike Reyes, he wasn't nervous. He was angry. I worked alongside Holt for years. Hopkins began. I saw him beat suspects, plant evidence, and threaten anyone who got in his way. Carter pressed further. Can you recall a specific incident? Hopkins nodded. 2019. A man named Aaron Foster. Holt arrested him, claimed he resisted. But the truth? Holt broke the man's ribs in the alley behind the station. And Rourke made sure the footage disappeared. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Monroe stole a glance at Holt. His jaw was clenched, but he said nothing. Then, it was Monroe's turn. She took the stand, hands steady as she swore her oath. "Commissioner Monroe," Carter said, "can you describe the events of the night you were assaulted by Officer Holt?" Monroe kept her voice even. "I was pulled over without cause. When I questioned him, he struck me. And what happened afterward? He falsified his report. He assumed the system would protect him." Carter nodded, but he didn't count on video footage. Monroe pulled a small recorder from her pocket. This." She pressed play. The courtroom filled with Rourke's voice. "Ko gi min lai? De kong fi ton fa lon. O de, chung toi kiem sot kong li." The weight of his words settled over the room. Langston tried to fight back, painting Holt as a scapegoat. "This is a political attack," he argued. "My client served this town for over a decade. Now he's being sacrificed to satisfy public outrage." But the evidence was overwhelming. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 3 hours. They returned with their verdict. On the charge of excessive force, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. Holt's face darkened, but he didn't flinch. Judge Stanton adjusted his glasses. "Craig Holt, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." Monroe exhaled slowly. It was done. Then, the judge turned to Rourke. "James Rourke, you are sentenced to 30 years for corruption, racketeering, and obstruction." Briggs, who had testified against them, received 5 years of probation. It was a deal that disgusted Monroe, but she knew they needed his testimony. As Holt was led away in handcuffs, he turned, locking eyes with Monroe. His voice was low, but she heard him clearly. "I'll be back. You got me, but you can't take down the whole system." Monroe didn't blink. "Watch me." The dust had settled, but the scars remained. The town of Ashton was quieter now, though its streets still carried the echoes of everything that had unfolded in the past months. Craig Holt and James Rourke were gone, their power dismantled, yet Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered beneath the surface. Victory was supposed to feel like relief. Instead, it felt like weight. Monroe sat in her office, staring at the stack of resignation letters on her desk. Some officers had quit voluntarily, unwilling to serve under her leadership. Others had been forced out, men and women whose loyalty had belonged to Holt and Rourke. Not to the badge. She had won the battle, but it had cost her. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Lisa Carter stepped in, a folder tucked under her arm. "It's done," she said. "The final article goes live tomorrow." Monroe leaned back in her chair. "And what's the headline?" Lisa gave a small smile. "The Fall of the Untouchables." The reforms had begun. New policies for accountability, body cameras for every officer, an independent civilian oversight board, all measures Monroe had fought for. Yet, despite the changes, she knew it would take time to rebuild trust. The people of Ashton weren't ready to believe in the badge just yet. Marcus Tate had already started his legal aid center, helping victims of police violence. "This isn't the end," he had told her over coffee the day before. "It's the foundation for something bigger." She had nodded, but deep down, she wondered how long this change would last before the old system found its way back in. Monroe walked through the station, feeling the stares of officers who still didn't trust her. Some respected her, others resented her, and a few still saw her as a traitor. But she had stopped caring about their approval a long time ago. When she reached her desk, an envelope sat on top. No return address. She opened it carefully, pulling out a single slip of paper. Holt was just the beginning. "Are you ready for what's next?" Her fingers tightened around the paper. She looked out the window, at the streets of Ashton. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The silence was deceptive. For weeks, things in Ashton had seemed to calm down. The police department had undergone changes. Officers loyal to Holt and Rourke had either resigned or been removed. And Monroe's reforms were finally being implemented. But beneath the surface, something dark remained. She could feel it. Lisa Carter had spent the morning at her office, combing through court documents, tracing the money trails that connected Holt and Rourke to others in the department. She had a theory, one that she wasn't ready to publish yet, but every clue pointed to the same conclusion. There were still powerful people in Ashton who weren't ready to let go of their grip. When she called Daryl Hopkins, she expected him to answer. Instead, she got silence. She tried again. Still nothing. Frowning, she grabbed her keys and headed out the door. Monroe sat at her desk, staring at an email she had received the night before. No sender, no subject, just a single line of text. This isn't over. Walk away. She had ignored the first few messages, dismissing them as desperate threats from the last remnants of the old guard. But now, with Hopkins missing and Lisa raising alarms about disappearing evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. Her phone rang. Lisa's voice was sharp. Daryl's gone. Monroe sat up. What do you mean, gone? I mean, no one has seen him. His phone's dead. I went by his house. His front door was open, and the security cameras were wiped clean. Monroe's grip on the phone tightened. Someone got to him, Lisa continued, and I don't think they're done. That night, Monroe met with Marcus Tate in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. He watched her carefully as she explained the threats, the missing witness, and the growing sense that something bigger was happening behind the scenes. You should leave, Erica, he said finally. Go somewhere safe. Fight this from the outside. Monroe shook her head. If I leave now, they win. Everything we fought for dies the moment I walk away. Tate sighed, rubbing his temples. Then you need to be prepared. Because they're coming for you. At 2:17 a.m., the gunshots rang out. Monroe had been asleep when the first bullet shattered her front window, embedding itself in the wall inches from where she had been sitting just hours before. She rolled off the bed, heart pounding, reaching for the weapon she kept in her nightstand. By the time she made it to the window, the street outside was empty. No cars, no figures lurking in the darkness. Whoever had fired those shots hadn't been aiming to kill. It had been a warning. She turned away from the window and exhaled. They weren't done with her yet. The world didn't change overnight. For all the battles Monroe had fought, for every corrupt officer removed, for every new policy put in place, there were still shadows lurking in Ashton. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the silence that stretched a little too long when she entered a room. The system had lost a few men, but the system itself, it was still standing. A week after Rourke's conviction, the FBI expanded their investigation. It wasn't just about Ashton anymore. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Links to state officials, ties to organized crime, a network that had been operating for years. What had started as one officer's abuse of power had spiraled into something much larger. Lisa Carter worked tirelessly, publishing story after story, exposing more cases of police brutality, wrongful convictions, and cover-ups. Her name was now on the radar of powerful people who preferred their business to stay in the dark. Monroe received a call from her late one evening. I'm starting to think we only cracked the surface, Lisa said. Monroe sighed. We always knew it wouldn't be that easy. Lisa hesitated before speaking again. Are you ready for another fight? Monroe looked around her office. The weight of everything pressing down on her. The exhaustion, the danger, the endless cycle. But beyond that, something else burned inside her. Determination. I wouldn't have started this if I wasn't. The reforms had begun. New oversight measures were put in place. Officers were required to wear body cameras at all times. Complaints against police misconduct were now reviewed by an independent board. A few officers had even come forward, willing to testify against the corrupt figures they had once feared. But the resistance was still there. Some of Holt's loyalists remained in the force, watching, waiting. Monroe saw it in their eyes when she passed them in the hallway. Resentment. Quiet defiance. She knew that for every step forward, there would be people trying to drag them back. That was the nature of this fight. One evening, Monroe found a manila envelope on her desk. No name, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It was of her, taken from a distance. Grainy but unmistakable. She was standing outside her own home. Beneath it, a single line of text. The battle has just begun. She exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the paper. They wanted to scare her. They wanted her to walk away. She wasn't going anywhere. The night was quiet as Monroe stepped outside the police station. She stood there for a long time, looking up at the building that had once symbolized power and oppression. It wasn't perfect, it never would be. But for the first time, she felt something new: hope. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. As Commissioner Monroe stood before the police department, she knew one thing for certain: change is never easy. And justice is never given, only fought for. Her battle wasn't just about one corrupt officer or a broken system in one small town. It was about the larger fight for accountability, for fairness, for a world where power serves the people, not controls them. So what do you think? Can true reform ever happen? Or is the system too deep to change? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that uncover the hidden truths of justice and corruption, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths. This is just the beginning.